There's a dime, and so that gives you an idea how small some of these little pieces are. That's not actually a little valve handle. There's a little elbow right there, and some various other little parts. There's another valve handle here, and they'll be painted red just because usually they're painted red so that they're easily identifiable when you're trying to shut off valves and so on. There's an elbow, so you can see against the dime how tiny those parts really are. This is how far I've gotten in 2 evenings. What I've done to start with is I've taken all the various little castings and so on, and I've blackened most of them just to give us some color so they're not silver, and then the ones that parts that would be painted I prime with a paint. In this case I've used a dark machine green. You can use any color. Usually typically it's going to be black, gray or green, and then what I've done is I've taken each of the parts individually before I do anything else, and I pre-drill all the holes in each of the components that require either a tube or a brass rod or a wire as the pin connection. And I use these particular drills. One of the reasons I use these because it doesn't matter whether I've got a large size, the shank is the same size as the smallest drill. So what that means is you don't have to do a lot of changing of the size of the chuck, as in this case. I'd have to, if I use this, I'd have to be changing this all the time, every time I change a different size. So and then I also use a parting disc, and I can use that to cut tubing and to length. And then once I've pre-drilled everything and everything's black and everything's primed with the paint, I start assembling it following the instructions. And the wheel itself, which is carrying a belt, is painted. As you can see, everything is painted. The bed, the pistons. Then I take and I file the surface of this wheel, this flywheel, taking rid of the parting line from the casting. When I get it absolutely smooth, there'll still be some tool marks in there from the file, and this is a soft enough material that I use a 6-0 steel wool and I buff it, and it's just a matter of polishing like this. And what that does, it cuts all the file marks out of there and leaves this really nice high polished finish. There's a little pulley over here on the end of the governor, same thing. Any of the moving parts after they've been blackened, like all the valve gear, the crank, bearings, these are some bearings in the side here, and they're all polished. Anything that appears to be a moving part, rubbing on something, is polished. And later on what I'll do is I'll start to repaint the pieces that I want. Also the casting, if you remember, I showed you this is a urethane casting, I think, for the bed, which is supposed to be a concrete base. That's all primed with gray paint. And then the governor is assembled. This is quite a number of pieces in here. This is only half done, believe it or not. The elbows have to be pre-drilled. A brass tube through here, brass tube down into the cylinder, out of the bottom, and then this brass tube here, which has to be larger than these two because this has to carry twice the steam that's coming out of here as the exhaust. And what I do is I put a piece, after putting these pieces in, I mark the center line on this brass tube, put it in a vise in the drill press. I use a flat file and I just put a little flat notch on that mark, so that when I drill that diameter into it, the drill doesn't wander. And so once that's drilled, I can slide that up. And in this case, rather than solder, I've used crazy glue because I don't have to have anything really strong. on a model like this nothing's going to be moving, but the crazy glue capillaries into those joints, and I clean it all up, and it's ready to go. There'll be another pipe and tube coming down into another exhaust over here, or supply line I should say, coming through in front of that and just below it. And this is the rest of the governor that is going to be assembled. It'll sit off the end and down to control the amount of steam coming into the cylinders. And the next part is going to be just to complete the assembly of the intake with these little remaining castings, and then we'll move on to all the oilers and so on around the perimeter. So it's come along, quite nicely, quite a ways. I'm about half done right now. Now it's all the fiddly stuff, all the very fine wires and lines and piping and so on will be going in next. So here is a close-up of the pieces that are all assembled. You can see the start of the governor. The valve gear going into the piston there. Back view, side. There's even detail on the side, little casting for the manufacturer, which I've got touched up in red. So what I do is I paint the face at it, because it is raised lettering. Once I paint it, and then I just take a blade and I'll lightly run the blade across the face with all the raised letters, and then the raised letters all stand out in silver. It's quite nice. Quite intricate. And I still have, probably, from what I can see there in my count, I've probably got about 50 more parts to assemble on the model still. Once I've cut the length of tubing that I want, you can do a lot of filing, but to really get a nice true edge, I use a square on the bed, and then I put the rod against the square, and then I feed it into the sanding disc. And in that way I just rotate it very slowly, and that way I get a perfectly square edge to the length of the tube. I've pretty much completed 90% of the model now. The components are all in place, starting with the steam intake. The steam line comes in here. There's a drain on the end, and the steam is entered through here, through this governor here. There's a shut-off wheel here. It opens and allows the steam in, and the governor spins. And there's a pipe goes into the top of the pistons into the steam chest and drives the engine. The steam exhaust lines come down for the bottom, and that larger pipe in the bottom will be the steam exhaust. I've touched up pretty much everything from handling it and done the casting on this piston steel pieces in here that were castings. There's a lubricator here, and there's some fine lines, wire lines here, because the lubricator is actually activated with a pump, and that rod here moves that lubricator pump handle and feeds the oil into the steam that helps to keep the pistons lubricated. I've also added oilers. You can see these little brass oilers here. They're mounted on top of all moving parts, so there's a lubricator constantly going. The last thing I have to do now is attach a leather belt from the pulley here at the governor down to the axle of the main drive shaft. And what I do in that case is I like to use drafting vellum. The drafting vellum is very stable, so I take a strip of it and I mix up a leather color, and I paint the top, and then next I'll paint the underside, and then I'll cut a fine ribbon and I'll attach it from the belt to the main axle. Once this is in place in the model, there are some drain lines down here, and I have small buckets, and I painted the inside black, and I'll throw some gloss paint in there to make the oil look wet, and then you'll weather the bucket. And then these will sit on the floor on the underside of these overflow lines, so the oil will drip down there. There's also, in the casting, there's also a little groove, so any oil spillage runs into that groove, and then there'll be a casting here that'll catch the overflow of the oil and take it down to a bucket again at the back on the floor itself. And that pretty much does it for now. So the next step I'll do is just complete this leather belt for the governor drive. The engine is now basically finished, with the exception of weathering, and the belt is on. As you can see, the drive belt to the governor, and the cup holders here for draining the chase groove along here to catch the oil that overflows.